Hey everybody, hope you're all having a good morning, evening, afternoon. Happy October. I'm gonna take just a minute to let some other people join and get everything up and running. Thank you so much for signing up for my new flying ointment class. Let's see. Hi, Hazel. Let's let everybody see me here for a minute. Hey, everybody. Hope everyone is having a good night. Thank you for joining us so late. Glad you made it. I've been drinking coffee all evening too to try and perk myself up and get ready for this, but I'm excited for it. It's going to be a good class. I've been doing flying ointment classes for, gosh, probably going on like 4 years now. So I've done a couple of different ones and they all sort of evolve and change as I do and, work with them more and study more. So I'm really excited to be sharing this one with you guys. I will have time for questions at the end. I'm not sure if it's going to take the entire 2 hours. I'm going to try and get finished in an hour and a half and then have time for questions at the end, because that's when a lot of the good information tends to come out, when you guys start asking questions and stuff. But I will get super distracted if I try and answer them during the presentation. So I'm trying to save you all from that. It's like we've got 10 people in here so far. That's awesome. I've got like 2 fans on me. I always start sweating before I do these things. It's a horrible, horrible side effect, I guess, of the nerves, which I don't really even feel that nervous, but apparently my body is stressed out. So. Can you guys see my PowerPoint? You're seeing my screen and everything? Cool. I am going to make the video screen go away so I won't be able to see myself, and then I'm going to expand the PowerPoint. So hopefully all good there. Having some technical issues, it looks like someone is. As long as I'm not. So yeah, it will be recorded. It takes the recording just a little bit to process, so I'll try and get that out later tonight. It might not be until tomorrow, but here we go. This is Flying Ointments, Science, History, and Magic. If this is the first time you're taking one of my classes, my name is Kobe Michael. I run the Poisoners Apothecary. I'm an entheogenic herbalist and occult practitioner, and I work with specifically poisonous, baneful, maligned, dark plants for all that they have to offer and teach us. So kind of in that umbrella is the topic of flying ointments, and that's generally when you're coming to it from the perspective of witchcraft, as far as entheogens and ethnobotanicals, which are plants that create divine experiences or spiritual experiences. Oftentimes when you're coming to that through witchcraft, the way that you're coming to it the first time is through flying ointments. There's a lot of other different ways to create entheogenic experiences, enact entheogenic rituals, because there is a big ritual aspect to them as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But flying ointments or witches' ointments are just one of the ways. So we're working with plant spirit medicine, phytochemistry, so they're just one sort of vehicle to get that plant spirit medicine and physical component into our system. So they are very popular. Like I said, it's usually one of the first ways people come to flying ointments or witches' ointments, and I use the terms kind of interchangeably. There are slight differences as we kind of look through the history of these ointments as they sort of developed into what they are today. The witch's ointment, flying ointment, transvection ointment, all of those refer to just kind of different little aspects of the history. So we will be looking at some of the historical aspects as well, just exploring and understanding how our ideas about flying ointments or magical ointments have kind of changed, and the different influences that have sort of shaped our understanding in regard to that. But most importantly, we'll be exploring the history of medieval witches' ointments and going through some of the recipes specifically to kind of unpack the ingredients, which you'll notice a lot of repetition in the recipes that we do have record of. So kind of looking through that and analyzing, what those ingredients are and why they would have been included scientifically and how that can help us making flying ointments today. So I did some little, I just like little objective things at the beginning of each section. So if it sounds like I'm repeating myself, I'm like looping back to different things, just because of the objectives that I put in there. So what actually is a flying ointment? Flying ointment by definition is something that we apply to the skin. It's a salve, it is in ointment form, and it creates a sort of spiritual psychedelic type of a flight or astral travel, where our consciousness is able to move without its body or move throughout the cosmos, throughout all different areas of the celestial chthonic realms. So by definition, a flying ointment is something that is used specifically to travel in spirit. There were psychedelic medicinal preparations that were used in folk practice kind of before the flying ointment that was sort of outside of the context of medieval witchcraft. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We do see magical salves also popping up in ancient mythology. So these are kind of the literal transvection ointments where someone literally was said to have, flown to said place. We also see flying ointments used by different deities in Greek mythology, Hera and Athena, using them for different purposes as well, from shape-shifting to love spells, transformation, cursing and hexing people. So there's all of these different uses for these magical ointments beyond just spirit flight. So they are kind of vehicles for this sort of numinous, other shadowy kind of power that certain individuals have kind of tapped into and learned to access for their different benefits. There's all different types of entheogenic herbs out there that have slightly different effects. My main specialty and area of interest is in the nightshades. The Solanaceae family, they contain the tropane alkaloids, and we'll be talking about some specific herbs a little bit more down the road later in the class. But that's kind of my main area of interest, just because those were typically the ones, with the addition of a couple of others, that we see popping up the most constantly. And kind of when we look at some of their correspondences and spiritual aspects, herbs like deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, they're the ones that kind of have the most affinity with witches and magical practice as well. So we get kind of a dual element there of the chemistry and correspondence. So they've all gone by different names: Unguentum sabati, Unguentum lamiarum, Unguentum diaboli, referring to their different uses of traveling to the witch's sabbat. Witch's ointment, Unguentum lamiarum, devil's ointment, because a lot of this is tied up in with some diabolical superstition, mainly coming from the Inquisition and church inquisitors at the time. We have this idea of the heretic's ointment, which is actually even an earlier example of kind of where the witch's ointment and the psychedelic salve of folk practice kind of became woven into this diabolical concoction used for spirit flight. So we will talk more about the heretic's ointment. So some of the contributing factors to kind of this modern idea of applying ointments, the idea of applying an ointment, lathering up a broomstick with this hallucinogenic ointment, and then that broomstick was inserted into one of the body orifices, was kind of the idea that was being perpetuated, or is perpetuated when someone looks at kind of the history of applying ointments, that's how they were applied, and they were kind of this weird sort of repressed sexual innuendo created by the church inquisitors. And it was actually something that really kind of popped up not until the 1970s. And it was a book called Hallucinogens and Shamanism by Michael Harner that kind of introduced and really solidified this sort of obscure idea of witches' ointments being used in this sort of masturbatory fashion. So then we have the idea of the witch's ointment itself becoming associated with the devil and the witch's sabbat and sort of this demonic sex orgy. And that really comes from the work of Cardano, one of our earlier recorded sources on applying ointments that actually influenced a lot of the subsequent ones. So what we have here is all of these sort of learned men, either employed by the church or of the church, or medical professionals that are just very rational minded. So that's basically who's having the conversation and writing all of the stuff down about what these ointments are. So none of them having actually used them or really having any understanding of that folk practice. So when we look at the ointments that are recorded, it's important to kind of remember that in that some of the ingredients are going to be obviously the baby fat and things like that as a derivative of the heretic's ointment. But also keeping in mind too that what is recorded is not actually from any trial records as far as these specific recipes. They are from individuals that were writing at the time, kind of arguing back and forth to whether these ointments were hallucinogens or diabolic concoctions or some combination of both. So like I mentioned earlier, they go all the way back to ancient Greece, and medicinal salves were really, really popular throughout the ancient world. Not even sort of talking about the magical aspect, salves were just a very common way of storing medicine and applying medicine, and were just very commonplace. One of the most popular ones and kind of like the earliest version of this was the unguentum populion, or the poplar ointment. And that was made with poplar buds from Populus balsamifera, the balm of Gilead. It's an 11th, 12th century recipe that contains henbane, red poppy, mandrake, and deadly nightshade. So that's kind of one of the earlier precursors to the recipes that would have been recorded in regards to the flying ointments. We see multiple nightshades and also poppy, which likely would have been the opium poppy. And interestingly, when we look at the alkaloids in the opium poppy actually negate or lessen some of the more negative effects of tropane alkaloid poisoning that we get with the solanaceae. So we'll see a lot of these recipes are kind of synergistic in the ingredients that they include. So going back to the Middle Ages, like I mentioned, healing salves were very commonplace. So it was a very convenient sort of a thing to go into somebody's house and search for evidence of witchcraft and go into their medicine cabinet and find some type of medicinal salve and say that that was the witch's ointment. There was no way to really test the ointments, and certainly no one was going to, apply them in court to, try and disprove them. So it was just sort of a really easy scapegoat that was used. And I think that the church kind of latched onto that. And it was sort of a combination of just a convenient way to pin this on people, and also sort of a medieval war on drugs. So at the same time, all of this is going on with the witch craze and trying to sort of repress people that think differently and oppress women in particular. It was also an effort to repress and sort of eradicate the knowledge that was still there in regards to folk medicine and all of the knowledge of all of the natural cures and herbs and things like that that were so prevalent, that would have been in each village or each town, to kind of demonize that and look down upon that. And so it was just as much something that the church inquisitors wanted to use sort of to their ends, as it was something that these physicians, as we're kind of coming into the early stages of like the age of enlightenment, rational thought and things like that, using these herbal salves to kind of spin this sort of weird picture of people using natural medicine, if that makes sense. So there is a lot of propaganda and superstition and just different societal things that really pop up in looking at the ointments and just the way that people thought at the time, and different taboos. And we see all of these sexual acts and inversionary rites and things kind of in opposition to the church that are sort of like these manifestations of like, what was the worst thing that a person could do at the time. And it all sort of got wrapped up into these. Looking at some of the recipes, one of the earliest is from Andre Laguna, and this gives an actual scientific account. So he was a physician, and one of his clients, patients, a gentleman came to him and said that his wife was having all of these issues with insomnia, and she was just sort of a hysterical mess. And it was because he had been cheating on her, so that was understandable. But in an effort to sort of quiet her down, he decides to test this ointment on her, and does a full write-up of what happened, applying the ointment. The woman falls into a very, very deep sleep that lasts for, I think it was close to like 30 hours. And then she comes out of the sleep and she recounts this story of traveling somewhere, and I think she went to a party and ended it off with she had sex with some young guy in her vision, in her dreams, and came back and she was in a great mood and well rested. And so it worked. It totally worked. And she got some revenge on her shitty husband. And so he recorded that ointment and recorded that process, mentioning specific ingredients. And he also refers to it specifically as a sleeping ointment or a surgeon's ointment. So the surgeon's ointment, sleeping ointment, these are all different examples of that early medicinal salve that would have contained all of these sleep-inducing or soporific ingredients like nightshades, opiates, probably, cannabis, definitely, and a couple of other ingredients that we'll get to in the next recipe. Girolamo Cardano in 1550. So this is one of the earlier mentions that I said went on to influence a lot of the other recipes. And this is where we'll really start to see kind of a pattern in things. So in his, he includes nightshade, and he doesn't specify any particular one, but it's likely going to be deadly nightshade. He also mentions monkshood, celery, cinquefoil, soot, and baby fat. So we all know the baby fat thing. That was a big, just a big made up thing that people were using baby fat to infuse these herbs into the ointment, and that comes from the heretic salve, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But here we get the main kind of two ingredients, nightshades and monkshood or aconite. We've also got cinquefoil, which that is not actually hallucinogenic or psychoactive. Cinquefoil or five-finger grass or tormentil, as it's called, Potentilla reptans, was a common ingredient in these medieval ointments as well. The only thing with it, it has a high content of tannic acid. So it's got a lot of tannins. It would be very bitter. It's astringent, and it does have some anti-inflammatory properties. So some of these other ingredients seem, as if they were just sort of added superfluously, or they don't really have, a major purpose as far as the psychoactive properties. But that being said, there were a lot of magical salves that did not have any entheogenic herbs in them. Magical salves made from various different animal ingredients or other herbs collected in certain ways on certain days of the week. So there were salves that did not have entheogenic herbs in them that were known for having a magical effect and being used in ritual and spell work. Reginald Scott is probably the most well-known, the most influential one, just because his book, The Discovery of Witchcraft, was like the most widely circulated piece of information on the topic at the time. And it was based on that earlier recipe by Cardano. So in Scott's recipe, we have the fat of young children and seethe it with water in a brazen vessel. So we're mixing the fat with water, boiling it in a brass vessel, basically rendering fat, and then using that to infuse with parsley, aconite, poplar buds, and soot. So we don't see the nightshade mentioned in this recipe, but we do have aconite or wolfsbane, which would have definitely some psychotropic effects. Wolfsbane is also extremely, extremely poisonous. Our next recipe, Johann Weyer, he mentions henbane seeds, deadly nightshade, hemlock, wild lettuce, red and black poppy, and opium. Also, we see darnel and purslane. So there's a few ingredients here that don't have any kind of entheogenic property, any kind of psychoactive effects. So we've got the second recipe there too. Yep, that one has darnel in it as well. So darnel was a grass or kind of a wheat that was a stowaway plant, and it was grown wild, and it's sort of used humans to propagate itself over the years by growing in our own fields of like wheat and barley and other cereal grains and things like that. So it had to be taken out by hand because the darnel grain is also the host for this symbiotic fungus. Do I have the name for it? I don't. That grows in it that's similar to the ergo fungus and it causes different types of poisoning, intoxication, delirium, hallucinations, and things like that. So this would have to be sort of filtered out. And with modern agriculture, it's not something that we really have to worry about anymore. But it was really, really prevalent throughout the ancient world and pre-modern Europe and things like that before modern farming techniques. Excuse me, guys. I don't talk all day and then I start talking and I can't. Yeah, so darnel, it has these hallucinogenic effects. Most of the bread in the Middle Ages was likely baked with darnel or ergo rye, or one of these hallucinogenic grains. So it's been suggested that the majority of people in the Middle Ages kind of spent their time in sort of this quasi-constant state of hallucination, which kind of makes sense and would explain a lot of the things of why people were so incorrigible and superstitious and fell into these sort of fanatical frenzies of things is because they were drugged by this bread that they were eating. But that was also suggested as an ingredient in one of these ointments. We've also got parsley, poplar buds. So poplar buds are they're very healing, they're anti-inflammatory, they're good for the skin. They do have some underworld associations, which is interesting. In my poplar ointment, I use it for a protective property to kind of protect the body while you are doing astral travel and spirit flight and things like that. I have heard mention that poplar buds were added to ointments to kind of negate some of the toxic effects of the other ingredients. I don't know that that is actually true. I could be totally wrong about that, but when we're talking about the Unguentum populion, it contained nightshade and it contained opium poppy. So those two synergistically together, they would have kind of counteracted the dangerous effects. So atropine, which is used, which is in belladonna, is used to treat opium overdose, or has been. And in the reverse, the opium kind of negates some of the more uncomfortable effects of the deadly nightshade. So that would have definitely done it. The poplar buds, I'm not so sure about. I think that was more so just another medicinal component. Next one, I want to mention that. So what I'm kind of getting to here is, I talked about Laguna already. Kind of getting to here, and I'll mention it again when we talk about specific ingredients, is that some of these ingredients that don't have any psychoactive property, ingredients like parsley and cinquefoil, when we look at their medicinal properties, they are very astringent. Parsley in particular, astringent, detoxes the blood. Cinquefoil with the tannic acid that I mentioned, that's very astringent as well. So astringents improve circulation. They unclog the pores. They help in balancing pH. They also contract the pores and kind of, it's used in skincare products to help seal in your moisturizer or seal in whatever other products you're putting on the skin. So by including all of these very astringent herbs, we are applying this ointment, warming up the skin, opening up the pores, and then the oil is being absorbed with the astringent properties, and it's actually helping to kind of push that further into the skin through working with the skin's pH and those astringent properties. And we'll talk more about pH here in a little bit. But it's interesting to look at some of the other medicinal properties of some of the more innocuous plants and see, why they could have actually been in there. Giambattista della Porta in Natural Magic. So this is another really popular recipe. that would have been based on that Cardano and Reginald Scott recipe as well. So we've actually got multiple recipes here with his, and one of the first ones to actually mention Datura, which maybe be something that was maybe added a little bit later. I don't think Datura really came through that part of Europe until a little bit later. Monkshood, wild celery, garden nightshade. So that could have referred to a variety of different nightshades. Solanum nigrum, which was thought to be soporific and have some of the similar properties, different varieties of it. The varieties that we have here are not. And then we've got, again, monkshood, wild celery. So you kind of see the pattern. So paying attention to that and sort of asking why those ingredients keep popping up beyond the obvious reasons. So what do the medieval ointments have in common? So they all have similar ingredients. We've seen that. They all have these soporific or somnotheogenic effects. So soporific describes something that induces a very, very deep sleep or stupor. Somnotheogenic, so we've got something that induces sleep, but also creates that spiritual entheogenic kind of an experience. So it could be anything from, opium to cannabis indica, any of the nightshades, anything that puts you in that really, really deep sleep. And it's generally a sleep that has very, very vivid dreams as well. So while it is a deep sleep, it is kind of a restless sleep. So those are soporifics or somnotheogenics. They all have very dramatic physical and psychic effects. So when we kind of compare them to modern flying ointments or ones that are sold to the public, like mine, for example, you're not going to rub a little bit of that on and be thrown into this stupor that's going to last for days. So there's a big difference there. But in all of the accounts of these medieval flying ointments, kind of by definition, that's what they are and that's what they do. This is a very kind of pronounced effect that when we get into the formulation, there is definitely a spectrum of, feeling the effects, but not being as dramatic, so where you're making these ointments to be used more for their pain relieving effects or for anti-anxiety effects or for sleep or, making them for a wide range of different people, it's important to, make the formula a little bit less concentrated, than if you were just making it for yourself, just because there's all of these different variables that come into play when different people are using them. Some of the effects of medieval flying ointments: madness, illusions of metamorphosis, flight, feasting, and sex. So in the accounts that we do have, the visions that are described are very much in line with the visions of the medieval witches' Sabbath. So generally having kind of a dark tone, sexual themes, different things like that. So it is kind of interesting that when people do describe working with these ointments historically, in the few accounts that we do have, that's the way that they are described. So while there is definitely that element of, sort of church propaganda, I think there is a little bit of, actual truth to it as well in something that has maybe transformed a little bit more over time, something that was kind of, maybe a typical pagan, earth-centered ritual, centered around cycles of sex and life and death and things like that, sort of became this diabolical thing, but they have a lot of the same components in common. So flying ointments were also used to affect other individuals, like I mentioned, so using them as a means for spellcraft. So they are putting you in that place that is outside of normal consciousness, kind of giving you that quality of otherness. And that in between or liminal place is a very powerful place to be and a very powerful place to do magic and ritual in. So beyond just applying the ointments and using them for dream work and spirit flight and things like that, actually using them in ritual and just sort of experiencing the difference between, you know, casting a spell without using a flying ointment or an entheogenic herb and casting a spell having used one, you know, viewing how the energy flows with you differently or how your perception is kind of different. There's just a lot of differences that can be experienced there in using flying ointments for more than just flying, but also for in spell work. So we have this idea of the heretic's ointment. The heretic's ointment is something that's been around for a very long time. It's only 8:30, so I will maybe talk slower. So the heretic's ointment has been used to, along with a number of other kind of accusations, has been used to demonize a wide variety of people. So we have these sort of antithetical groups of people that they're in opposition to whatever structure is in power at the time. So they become ostracized and they become demonized, and they have all of these different you know, names and characteristics and things attributed to them. And this has happened all throughout history. So the idea of cannibalism and infanticide, killing babies, things like that, drinking human blood. You know, these are all things that have been attributed to different groups of people throughout history. So the Romans did it to the pagans, pagans did it to the Jews, no, Jews did it. Jews, Christians, pagans, everybody has been accused of these things at one time or another. You know, so we have the Catholic Church accusing the Cathars and the Waldensians of the same things, while they were just another group of Christians. They didn't align with what the Roman Catholic Church was teaching, so they became heretics. So that practice of heresy, of going against the church, of going against the state-sanctioned religion, was sort of wrapped up in this idea of going against society and having all of these different taboos. And the Aurores Gazazorium is the sort of first mention of that. And this is in reference to the Cathars, tying them together with the heretic's ointment, the witch's sabbat, you know, and a lot of the accusations of the Knights Templar, the osculum infame, you know, sodomy, all of these different sort of accusations applied to these different groups of people. So the flying ointment, it started out as an actual sort of flying ointment that could be used for magical purposes. It could be used to travel to different places. And we see that throughout ancient mythology, especially with the ancient Greeks. And then it sort of transforms into what we understand as the witch's ointment or transvection ointment. So it has gone through this sort of transformation process. And now here we are with modern ointments. So what are some of the differences and similarities? The first one would kind of be herb availability. So the herbs that would have been available during the Middle Ages, generally everyone is growing their own medicinal herbs or wild harvesting them. They're not being mass farmed or anything like that. So, typically they're a little bit better. They're a little bit more organic. So on that end, and then on the other end, our herb availability is much wider. So we don't just have what's locally available, growing around us. So we have a lot of different options when it comes to different states of consciousness that we're trying to induce. So all of a sudden the witch's salve, now it becomes, it's not only something to go to the witch's sabbat, but to travel in the astral realm or the dream realm, or go and talk to the dead, or meet with an animal spirit familiar through shape shifting, or even using it in like manipulative love magic and aphrodisiac massage oils. And there's this ancient idea of it's called the pocula amatoria, and it was a psychoactive love potion. So all of these sort of psychoactive formulas and things like that kind of wrapped up in the flying ointment as a vehicle to achieve all of those different states. So for example, like casting a love spell, taking some aphrodisiacs beforehand, Damiana tea or smoking blend, or something that's going to generate that same sort of energy or feeling within you that sort of matches up with whatever it is that you're trying to do. So herb availability really widens our scope of practice and our options as far as what we're able to use flying ointments or magical ointments for, as far as inducing different entheogenic states of consciousness. So like I was saying earlier, the ointments that I make, they're not going to knock you out. I have gotten some really awesome feedback from people. I wish I had more feedback for like research purposes. And just through using them myself, they definitely have a noticeable, perceptible effect, but it's not going to be the same thing as, eating half an eighth of mushrooms or, smoking a bunch of cannabis. It's going to be much more subtle. They're working in synergy with other herbal ingredients, and absorption is a little bit slower when working with topical application versus like something that you're actually, ingesting orally. So the absorption there is going to be a little bit different, but if you apply them in the correct way, in the correct setting, and know kind of how to use them and what to expect, then you kind of start to understand and be like, okay, this is, a broad spectrum of, different states of consciousness that we're working with. It's not just going from, normal consciousness to all of a sudden this extreme, hallucinogenic sort of experience. I think, do I have what to expect? So there's definitely sort of a relaxing, grounding effect, a heaviness that comes with working with the nightshades, I've noticed, that you don't have with some of the other plants. So it's the kind of thing that really sort of weighs you down in your chair. They are chthonic, they're associated with the underworld, and they are Saturnian herbs, so they do have that heaviness to them, which is probably why they are such good sedative, relaxing type of herbs when used in the right way. And other things that you may notice are like slight visuals. There's something that is common among a lot of people when using nightshade ointments. They will see little sparks of light kind of all over the place. It's generally in like a dark room or something, but the nightshades in particular, they really play with our perception of light and darkness. So you can kind of intensify that by doing your experience in like a very dimly candlelit room, or no light at all, and using that that sort of subconscious, visual field of when there is no light to kind of see what comes through, almost as like a kind of scrying. So different experiences like that, definitely, deep sleep, vivid dreams. Those are the kind of things to sort of expect from modern flying ointment. There's also different carrier oils available. So the way that we're making ointments, I'm assuming everybody knows the way that flying ointments are made. It's basically just an herbal infusion. So herbs added to oil, it's infused, and then you add wax to it to make it a thicker salve consistency. So that's literally all it is. It's a thick infused oil. But the carriers that would have been used in the Middle Ages would have been different from the carriers that are available today. And we'll talk more about that, kind of getting into some of the ingredients, but the most commonly available one would have been pork lard. Maybe they would have had access to like some kind of unprocessed olive oil or something like that. But today we've got jojoba oil, grapeseed oil, coconut oil. We've got access to practically every possible kind of animal lard that we could hope for. So we've got a lot of different options, and when we start to look at those sort of from a chemical perspective, those different carrier oils all have different behaviors and different effects when it comes to extraction and absorption. And I know that's the part that I'm trying to get to. So just a few more options for when we should use flying ointments. Use them whenever you want to. There's not a right or a wrong way to use them, as long as you're using them kind of in a ritual context, a ritual mindset. There is, just applying one as sort of like a spell oil or like a vibrational type of a thing. So maybe you're wanting to work with the belladonna plant spirit and kind of incorporate its mysteries or its lessons. So it's totally fine to just like put a little bit on every day, not, any like noticeable amount or anything like that, but just as sort of an anointing kind of a thing. So that's totally acceptable. And then we have, applying it in larger amounts and in different ways for more entheogenic experiences. But the amount that you apply and the way that you use it, can vary based on your needs. So initiatory experiences, meeting with familiar spirits, connecting with specific currents of energy. So a lot of the plants being associated with deities of witchcraft, spirits of the dead, the underworld, all of that kind of darker mythology. So connecting with those different currents of energy as we're working with them in our craft. Just the different mysteries of, go into, Luciferian gnosis, or working with Lilith, or working with any of these figures that sort of fall under that umbrella of being associated with the spirit world, or the dark moon or the crossroads. These are all entities that are associated with many of these plants, and these are generally the entities that most folk practitioners or land-centered practitioners that we're interested in working with are those spirits of the crossroads, liminal spirits, ancestral spirits, land spirits. They can be used in seasonal rituals, so using them throughout different times of year on the different holy days, incorporating kind of the additional energetics of that specific day and the veils being thin. That's all going to have an influence on your experience. So plant spirit familiars, those are just the overarching kind of genius of the plant. So each plant has its kind of own personality or own characteristics, and over the years and accumulating different pieces of mythology and folklore, the plants kind of take on a personality of their own. So when we work with the plant spirit familiar and we work with them on a very regular basis and become familiar with them, we come to kind of a deeper understanding of the things that are specifically associated to that plant spirit familiar. So there may be certain lessons or certain themes that resonate with you for whatever reason that you also share in common with that particular plant spirit familiar. So in effort to work with them or connect with them, one way to do that would be to apply a flying ointment or even a flying oil to kind of incorporate their vibration and enter into sort of a dialogue with that plant spirit. And that can be done through visionary meditation, shamanic journeying, so kind of path working, visualization, which eventually leads into more entheogenic experience and takes on a life of its own. And I do a lot of different guided meditations on Patreon, kind of building a collection of different meditations in going to different places and interacting with different spirits and interacting with different energies using these different entheogenic preparations. So using them in different journeys like that. It can also be used to inspire creativity, insight, new experiences. So in the same way that some of the more psychedelic herbs inspire creativity, just through kind of changing brain waves, changing perception, changing frequency. Lots of different ways to use them. How do we apply them? So most of us are used to spell oils and ritual oils that, we dab a little bit out of the bottle and like rub it on the candle or whatever, put a little bit here, put a little bit there, and that's good. But with these, unless they're extremely, extremely concentrated, that's not really going to do anything other than incorporate the plant's energetics and the plant's vibration. So really thinking about how we are applying these for increased absorption so that we don't have to make something that is super strong and potentially dangerous, that we can get to where we're trying to get to through the means of application and using a consistent kind of a formula to work our way up to, where we're wanting to be. Some of the suggested things would be rubbing the skin. That comes from one of the medieval recipes. So rubbing the skin until it starts to get red. We're bringing the blood flow to the skin, increasing the circulation, increasing the temperature. That's going to open up the pores. So all of those things are meant to help that ointment penetrate the skin better. I'm really sorry. Oh, the coughing. I promise I'm not sick. I just smoke way too much. Another thing is a larger surface area. So you can take the same amount of ointment and apply it to a very, very small area, and it's going to take much longer for that same amount to actually absorb into the bloodstream versus covering an entire part of your body. So you're still using the same amount, you're just spreading it around way more. And by increasing the surface area, increasing the different places on your body that it's been applied to, it's going to be absorbing through all of those at the same time. So in a lot of the older accounts, we hear of these women that literally drench themselves head to toe in the entire ointment. So they're getting like 100% bodily absorption. I wouldn't maybe recommend that right away until you're more familiar with the formula. But that's kind of the idea there, is that the larger the surface area you apply it to, the faster it's going to absorb. There's also different parts of the body that are going to absorb a little bit better. And we always hear, not to apply them to mucous membranes, inside the nose, inside the mouth, the genitals, because they absorb almost immediately. And that is true. I have had some people that have said they've put my ointment on their lips, different things like that. So it's definitely a truth that they do absorb faster in those more sensitive areas. There are other areas that are maybe not as risky as far as applying them to the genitals or something like that, or inside your mouth. So doing the underarms, or my favorite is the soles of the feet. So just coating like the entire bottom of both feet in an ointment and then putting your socks on. So then you've got like that extra added layer of sort of insulation, and things also absorb very readily through the feet. That's one of my favorite ways to apply it, especially for more of the soporific effects, the sleep-inducing effects. Kind of has this overall relaxing effect to the body, an anti-spasmodic effect when you apply a nightshade ointment to your feet. It's very, very grounding, very, very relaxing. And there are even some nightshade or datura flower foot soaks that are used traditionally, that are used for exhaustion and being overworked and sore muscles and things like that. And the datura flowers are infused into a foot bath, where they are absorbed through the feet. So that's one of my favorite places to apply. And once you get really, really comfortable with an ointment, especially if it is one of the safer ones, like henbane or mandrake, that we don't have to worry so much about applying them to sensitive areas, I think there is some potential there, but I'm not going to recommend that. But there's a reason, that people mention this, and the reason is that it's true. They absorb much better that way. So how are flying ointments made? So we know that they're made with oil infusions. So taking the plant material and infusing it into some type of a carrier oil, usually some type of a vegetable oil. This is typically done with heat to facilitate the extraction process. Some potential flying ointment ingredients. We've got the nightshades, henbane, deadly nightshade, datura, mandrake. So those are going to work because of the tropane alkaloids. So the tropane alkaloids are a group of chemicals, scopolamine, atropine, hyoscyamine. They're used for their analgesic properties, pain relief, various gastrointestinal issues, as antispasmodics, nausea medications for both sedative and stimulating effects. We've got cinquefoil, which is a traditional ingredient, cinquefoil, yarrow, and like we discussed earlier, parsley and darnel. So these are all ingredients mentioned in traditional or historic flying ointment recipes. These are all astringent. So like I was saying earlier, astringents help to open up the pores, increase the absorption of moisturizers and other skin products, and then seal those products up into the skin. Poppy, so opium, that one's self-explanatory. We all know what that does. Poplar buds, and then we come to the artemisias, wormwood, and mugwort. So those are going to contain thujone. Thujone is psychoactive in large doses, so we're getting more of a synergistic effect, and also some energetics and correspondence in using mugwort and wormwood, but not going to be psychoactive in the sense that we're typically thinking. Ingredients like wolfsbane and hemlock, so these are in the traditional recipes, and that's undeniable. Wolfsbane and hemlock are very, very poisonous, especially if they're worked with this fresh plant material. when both of those plants dry, their alkaloids degrade very rapidly. So generally, dry plant material isn't going to be nearly as dangerous as fresh plant material. Generally, we wouldn't infuse fresh plant material into oil anyway, because of botulism contamination with bacteria. But they're two of the most poisonous plants. So wolfsbane is the most poisonous in Europe, and different types of water hemlock being the most poisonous in North America. So definitely being careful with those. And those are going to be the alkaloids aconitine and conine. So both of those are extremely volatile. They behave a little bit differently than tropane alkaloids. They're also going to evaporate more rapidly, which is why they're degraded so much with drying. So we generally see these in reference to some kind of shape shifting, transformation into a wolf or some type of a warrior, berserker type of a situation, but some type of a shape shifting. And when we look at the symptoms of actually applying products that contain wolfsbane and hemlock, they do give a sensation of moving through the air, you know, feelings of icy cold. So like, you know, like a cold breeze or whatever, but also, and most interestingly, the sensation of having hair or having feathers. You know, so we see an actual physical manifestation through these plants' chemical effects and some of their associated folklore. And then we have fly agaric. So this is a fungi. These can also be used in flying ointments. I have an ointment that I make that it uses a datura infusion. And then that gets infused with the fly agaric or Amanita muscaria mushroom. The tropane alkaloids and the muscimol or muscarinic alkaloids in the mushroom, they kind of act synergistically as well in a similar way to how opium and tropane alkaloids behave. So the muscimol negates a lot of the uncomfortable side effects of tropane alkaloids, and the tropane alkaloids negate some of the uncomfortable side effects or more dangerous side effects of the muscimol. So they kind of balance each other out. So in this way, we're combining two plants that separately in larger doses, they may cause some uncomfortable side effects or some very intense kind of situations, but when we combine them together and they work synergistically, it's a much more beneficial experience. And there's some interesting synergy between a lot of these, and then some of the essential oils that you can use as well. Before I talk about the essential oils, of course, cannabis is another one that could be added into a flying ointment. I think I have an article at the end that is about cannabis and witches' ointments. But that can also be applied topically. You know, that, of course, decarbing it first, putting it in the oven at a low temperature before infusing it into the oil. That way it can become decarboxylated to facilitate that absorption, because not all of these chemical constituents are absorbed in the body the same way. You know, there's different things that we have to do to them to make it so that we can experience the, you know, the euphoria and some of the more psychoactive effects. And I mention that because decarboxylation is kind of an example to my approach to making flying ointments, is how do the chemical components in the ointments behave, and what can we do to make them behave better? You know, so how do they act in different carriers? You know, what can be added to them to improve that process of extraction and absorption? And the essential oils, some of the different essential oils that I use in my ointments are going to be things like clary sage. Of course, I use mugwort and wormwood. Spikenard, which also has some euphoric, aphrodisiac, different effects to it. But my theory with the essential oils is that they also are very kind of volatile in that they evaporate very quickly. They're also absorbed very quickly. So I think that the addition of essential oils in a lot of these ointments, I'm kind of finding sort of helps to facilitate the absorption. And that could just be sort of my own conjecture there. But I do think that incorporating the essential oils definitely has a synergistic effect with the other plant components. But beyond that, it also helps with absorption. So how do flying ointments work? So that is through the tropane alkaloids. They're anticholinergics. They interrupt the transmission of acetylcholine and anticholinesterase in the brain, just slightly differently from how alkaloids like the wolfsbane and hemlock alkaloids act. So these are anticholinergic. They have a profound effect on our perception of light and dark, like I mentioned earlier, but also sort of our body's sleep system. Tropane alkaloids in particular, they affect the pineal gland, which is sort of our body's sensor for when it's time to go to bed and when it's light and dark out. Our melatonin production can be affected. So all of those things that kind of relate to that sleeping, waking consciousness are affected by those tropane alkaloids. What else was I going to say? Okay, so now we'll get into more of the preparation, extractions, things like that. Right, so when we talk about tropane alkaloids in particular, one thing that we hear a lot is that they are not oil soluble. And to an extent that is true. So they do not extract as readily into oil as they would into water or alcohol or some other type of a carrier. So why do we have these examples of medieval flying ointments that contain these ingredients that are made using oil infusion methods that have these very, very pronounced effects if the alkaloids aren't being completely absorbed? And that has to do with the carriers that were used. So I had mentioned earlier the animal lard and olive oil. So animal lard, it is going to have a very high fatty acid content. So getting into pH, acid is always going to extract tropane alkaloids a little bit better than something that is not acidic. It's keeping them in their salt form, their sulfate form, which is the most easily absorbable when in a more acidic environment. So the pork lards that were used, they had that difference in pH. So they are able to extract those properties a lot better than things like grapeseed oil or some of the more modern processed vegetable oils. Another benefit that we have with the pork lard in particular is that pig DNA is very, very similar to human DNA. So when it comes to absorption and sort of the permeability of lipid layers and things like that, pork fat absorbs easier than plant fat because it's closer to our own DNA. So that transfer is able to happen a little bit easier. And this has to do with the structure of the skin. The skin has what's called the acid mantle, which is kind of a protective pH layer. And when I talk about pH, I know I haven't mentioned this yet, but pH is a scale of measurement of whether something is acidic or alkaline or basic. So it is a spectrum from acidity to alkalinity. 0 to 14, the closer to 0, the more acidic, the closer to 14, the more alkaline. So when I talk about pH, that's what I'm talking about, is whether something's acidic or alkaline or basic. So we have this acid mantle, and the acid mantle protects us from bacteria, and it also can interfere with the absorption of certain types of products. So in skincare, we'll see this. This is kind of overcome by using things like alpha hydroxy acids, or different polar formulas and different electrodes that use positive, negative poles and changes in pH to increase the permeability of the skin. So we can kind of use that to how we think about applying ointments and extracting ointments and things like that. pH plays a big role. So considering our different options that we have for infusion, which would be the best ones? So animal lard has the benefit of just being, similar with us. It's got that high fatty acid content. It's just going to work well. It absorbs really, really well. You don't have to add wax to it, or you don't have to add as much wax to animal lard to get it to thicken up. So it absorbs through the skin very easily. It doesn't leave behind any kind of residue, which if you have applied a plant-based ointment that contains wax, it generally stays on your skin. It doesn't go anywhere. This disappears. So that's great, but not everybody wants to use animal products, and that's totally fine. So what other options could we use? Olive oil would have been another very traditional option that would have been available. And today, typically it's the extra virgin olive oil, but what we would really want to get closer to what would have been traditional would have been unprocessed olive oil. So as unprocessed and unvirginated of an olive oil as you could find, that's going to have a much higher acid content than something that has been processed. And that higher acid content is going to work in our favor because it's going to pull all of those tropane alkaloids out. So with pH and with herbal extraction, pH kind of works like a magnet. So because the alkaloids are basic, they have a higher pH. If we use an acid with a lower pH, it's going to pull them out of the plant material. And so the unprocessed olive oil is going to be good for that as well. We can also kind of go to the other end of the spectrum, because it's not just acids that will pull the tropane alkaloids out, because they work really well in alcohol. And alcohol is neutral in pH. It's right around a 7. So it's not entirely acidic. It's not entirely alkaline, but it's a polar formula. We're not going to talk about protons and electrons. It's too late for that. So because it is closer to neutral, it is less acidic than something like the olive oil or animal lard. So one of the oils that would be closer to that would be coconut oil. Coconut oil has a pH that is right around 6 or 7. A little pH chart here. I did an experiment where I actually tested the pH of all of my oils and all of my alcohols with and without any herbs infused into them, just to see like whatever any of the differences were. But the coconut oil, it does have a higher pH. Coconut oil is typically what's suggested to be used in the magic butter machine as well. So when we're extracting THC from cannabis, making edibles and things like that, it's kind of the same idea of, you know, what's the best thing to hold and absorb this product. So with that, again, the coconut oil, I have experimented a little bit with the sunflower lecithin. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but kind of applying what I've learned and know about infusing cannabis into different things, also into how I make my flying ointments. So coconut oil works really, really well. So we kind of run into an issue in that acids extract the alkaloids better, but acid is also what the pH of our skin is. So I mentioned they were like magnets. If we have two positive magnets going towards each other, they're going to push each other apart. So while acid extracts great, and it's great for like internal absorption, if we're actually consuming something, extracting with acid isn't that helpful, you know, applying an acidic product to the skin. Because just like in skincare, acidic products are going to close all the cuticles down, or close all of the pores down. So we need something that is a little bit more alkaline to facilitate that absorption. So with the coconut oil, we're getting that because it is more alkaline. So coconut oil is going to absorb through the skin a little bit better than, say, like grapeseed oil. So besides coconut oil, one other way that I've been using to enhance absorption is adding ashes to some of my formulas. So in medieval flying ointment recipes, we generally see soot is mentioned. And that is because soot is carbonized wood, it's carbonized organic material. So it is very alkaline, it's very basic. So when we add it to something, it's going to raise the pH. So when I'm making, for example, my ungüentum venenum, which is my one flying ointment, it's the strongest one. It contains an infusion of henbane and deadly nightshade. And in addition to that, I add a little bit of wood ash, black wood ash, and that raises the pH of it and it helps to facilitate the absorption. So the reason that we see soot coming up so much in medieval ointment recipes was not because they wanted to be able to see where they were applying the ointment. It was to raise the pH of the very acidic oil that they had used to extract the plant medicine, raise the pH so that it could then cross the acid barrier of the skin and facilitate that process. So I'm sure you guys will have lots of questions about the extraction and pH and different things like that. So some of the specific plants, we have deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna. This one is going to be very chthonic, very underworld related. It's going to have a very heavy kind of a feeling to it, very, very grounding, very earthy. This is also a really good one to work with when dealing with any kind of like sexual themes, sexual taboos, traumas, healing, anything like that. Henbane is typically the one that's most associated with the dead, necromancy, speaking with spirits. Typically, we see this one used in an incense. Henbane is one of the safer nightshades. There are no deaths irrefutably linked to the consumption of henbane. It is also one that we can safely use in massage oils and other formulas, and not have to worry so much about not getting them on sensitive parts of our bodies. So a lot of these nightshades also have aphrodisiac effects. So using them for those aphrodisiac effects in different types of aphrodisiac massage oils and things like that. Like I mentioned, kind of the more manipulative love magic, because these plants do have aphrodisiac qualities, but they're kind of like the dominatrixes of the plant world. So these are not gentle Venusian love magic herbs. These are sexy, sultry, and yeah. Datura also, so this one does have a big connection to love magic, especially in Mexico and South America, where the datura juice is used in different types of coercive or manipulative love spells. We have the tropane alkaloids. These are the active components that make the nightshades able to do what they do. So we've got scopolamine. This one is most prominent in datura, also henbane. It's going to have slightly more sedative effects. This is where we're getting like the anti-nausea medication, anti-motion sickness. Hyoscyamine down here. This one is going to be found, generally in all of them in varying amounts, but more predominantly we see this in henbane and belladonna, and we know that that rapidly converts into atropine when the plant material is dried or extracted. They're all going to behave in relatively similar ways. So in smaller doses, they can be more sedative, more analgesic, more relaxing. In larger doses, they can become deliriant. They can become stimulating, to where the person sort of becomes aggressive and when they're in that state of mind. So structurally, they are very similar. Atropine is the racemate of hyoscyamine. So they're literally, when hyoscyamine converts into atropine, the hyoscyamine molecules basically make a mirror image of themselves, and that becomes the atropine molecule. So they're literally just a reflection of one another. So thinking about your mixing ratios, this is going to come into play with dosing. So typically all of my mixing ratios for the products that I sell are at a 1 to 10. And that's going to vary a little bit depending on if it is something that I've infused a tincture into. If I've already got a belladonna infused oil and then I add a henbane tincture to that and boil out the alcohol, that's going to be a little bit more concentrated than if I have belladonna oil and henbane oil and I mix the two together, if that makes sense, because the volume of that, the tincture is disappearing. Same thing with my trickster salve. I'll take a datura infusion that's already been infused and then I add my amanita powder to that. So I'm not adding any more oil to it. So that's actually becoming more concentrated. But typically everything is a 1 to 10. And I do that so that I know that for every 1 ounce tin, for every 30 milliliters, there's never going to be more than the equivalent to 3 grams of plant material. 3 grams is kind of the threshold for the majority of these plants. As far as a lot of the toxic symptoms. And once you cross over that threshold, that's kind of when you get into more of the toxic, deliriant, uncomfortable kind of side effects. So that's what I've always kind of used as my rule of thumb. So even if somebody decided to take the entire 30 milliliters and rub it all over their entire body, they're not going to be getting more than that 3 grams. So that's just kind of a safeguard, but also kind of thinking, in terms of how much actual plant material is in that 1:10 ratio or is in that 1:5 ratio. So typically I'm working with larger amounts of plant material. So it would be 25 grams of plant material to 250 milliliters of carrier oil. But if you're working with smaller amounts, the ratio will be the same. It's just going to be smaller amounts of material. We could bump that down to a 1:5, which would give us 3 milligrams for every 15 milliliters. So maybe we're wanting to get more than one dose in our little tin. Maybe we're not wanting to have to put an entire 3 ounces of infused oil or 30 milliliters of oil all over our bodies. So maybe we want to make it a little bit more concentrated. So if we go down to 1:5, that means there's 15 milliliters in 3 grams or 3 grams in 15 mils. If we go a little bit lower, down to a 1:3 ratio, that's going to put 3 grams of plant material inside 9 milliliters. So with that, that's when you're going to get to probably like your most concentrated dosage as far as like an ointment is concerned, in applying just like a little teaspoon sized amount to actually get some noticeable effects. So thinking about them in that way. It is 9:24. So we've got about 30 minutes, I think, before this ends. I'm going to do like a really quick little breather break. And then if anybody has any questions, a lot of these next slides are things that I've already, I think, discussed, but I'm going to flip through this slide when I come back. I need to just use the restroom real quick. Okay, sorry about that. Too much coffee. So safety, preparing for flight, ritual. Just going to real quickly go through the importance of ritual mindset. So just like with any type of psychedelic experience, your setting, what's around you, what you're thinking about, that's all going to be very, very influential on the experience. So using these in a magical capacity for spiritual purposes, ritualizing the application is going to be very, very important. So there has to be some kind of intention. There has to be some type of ceremony, whether that's just giving thanks, blessing the medicine, something very simple, just as simple as like a meditation type setup, something like that to sort of differentiate between recreational use and entheogenic use. And that's going to be a major influence on the experience as well. Some people like to fast beforehand. You could do 24 hours, you could do as many hours as you're comfortable with. It doesn't have to be a full fast, just typically avoiding things like sugar, alcohol, really, really fatty, greasy foods. Those are going to interfere with absorption. Meat is another thing to stay away from. And prior to the application, generally 30, 45 minutes before you're actually going to do the ritual, avoiding any kind of like caffeine, nicotine. Both of those are going to kind of act inhibitively or counteract some of the effects of the tropane alkaloids. So avoiding those. Safety would just be, don't put it anywhere dangerous, any sensitive areas. Making sure that you kind of have your plan of what you're going to be doing for the evening. I always like to have like a journal or something like that to kind of record the experience too. Generally with the tropane ointments, you're going to be falling asleep. So just because you don't experience something while you're awake doesn't mean that you did it wrong. Generally the majority of what happens with these ointments, especially the ones that contain nightshades, is happening while you are asleep. Just a few different references here. The Witch's Ointment by Tom Hatsis is a very extensive and awesome history of medieval flying ointments. There is another resource that is called, and I don't have it up here, put it in the chat. It is an essay by a religious studies professor at Arizona State University. His name is Michael Osling. It's called Baby Fat and Belladonna. And it is a shit show. He tries to disprove the existence of the ointment altogether and its ritual use, and doesn't do a very good job at it. But he has a really, really good bibliography. So literally every written piece of information on flying ointments is in that bibliography. And you can find the PDF for that online. Michael Osling, Baby Fat and Belladonna. I mentioned that because the next one, These Goddamn Ointments, 4 Histories by Tom Hatsis, is actually in response to Baby Fat and Belladonna. These Goddamn Ointments is a really awesome one to read through. This is the one that I would read from beginning to end. The Michael Osling one, I would just skip to the bibliography. And of course, we have the discovery of witchcraft, which was kind of meant to discredit a lot of what we do, but in effect, it preserved a lot of really awesome folk magic. So use that. Then we've got How to Fly a Broom, or How to Fly Without a Broom. That was the one that I mentioned that was about cannabis and flying ointments, things like that. And then we've got By Moonlight and Spirit Flight, The Praxis of Otherworldly Journey to the Witch's Sabbath, and that's by Michael Howard, who is one of my favorite authors. So I definitely recommend that one. And that's just kind of about the act of nocturnal flight and the Witch's Sabbath in general. Of course, I have to plug my own book. It is about flying ointments, The Poison Path Herbal. That is available now. To Fly by Night. That's another really awesome book that's on hedge witchery. So all kinds of spirit flight, border crossing. Another awesome one, Phantom Armies of the Night by Claude Lecouteux. So this explores the entire concept of that nocturnal procession of spirits and demons and deities, known as the Wild Hunt. That was a major influence for the idea of the Witch's Ointment. And then if you're interested in the chemical side of it, understanding alkaloids and extraction, I recommend this one, Understanding Medicinal Plants. And that's by Brian Hansen. And then another really good one too for herbal medicine in general, but it does specifically talk about the extraction of alkaloids and some of those important concepts there. The Herbal Medicine Maker's Handbook. So I think I got through all the stuff. Yeah, so the masturbatory thing, the masturbating with broomsticks, that's a complete fabrication. I think there was one maybe obscure mention of something like that, but it was more along the lines people were oiling up stangs and farm tools, and even I think one person did a chair, and they were literally riding those to the Sabbath. So there was no insertion, there was no masturbation. That was really like a complete kind of idea that was perpetuated because of this one author in the 1970s. Not to say that the Inquisitors, they didn't have a lot of repressed sexual things that came up all throughout the Inquisition, but the masturbating with the handles of brooms just wasn't one of those things. And for the simple fact of brooms in the Middle Ages are not the brooms that we have in our kitchen today. They were literally a branch, from a tree that we put bristles on. So it wouldn't have been something to do that with for sure. Is there a reason we don't see Brugmansia used very often in salves? I don't know that it has so much to do with irritation, though I do experience a little bit of irritation with like fresh datura. I don't notice it with the datura infusions. I think that is more so, the idea of these magical salves is very connected to like Western esoteric tradition, with the origins in Greece and the Scythians with their shape-shifting ointments and things like that. So it's a very Western concept. So any kind of like ethnobotanical uses of Brugmansia, you're generally going to be coming out of like South America or that part of the world. And the way that they work with the plants is very, very different from the way that we're working with witches' ointments, and it's a much, much more intense rite of passage kind of a thing that's only going to be done, once in a lifetime. Where with witches' ointments, we're kind of using them on a recurring basis. So I think that might be the reason for Brugmansia. Let me maybe stop screen sharing. Yeah, if anybody wants to turn on their camera, I guess y'all. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you hear?
Yep.
Cool. I'm just trying to figure out how is best to incorporate tinctures into like an ointment, because that's how I've been preserving things is via tincture, because I wasn't quite sure how to do the extraction with oils and feel comfortable with it yet. So anyway, so that whole deal, how do I put the alcohol in the fat?
Yeah, so with that, the amount of the tincture, like the actual volume of liquid, when you're doing it that way, it doesn't really matter so much. So typically when we make a tincture, we're doing like 100 milliliters to whatever the amount of plant material is, where with this, we're eliminating the alcohol. So it's generally, when I do that, I'll add just enough alcohol to actually cover the plant material. So like, let's say I'm wanting to make an ointment. I'm just going to do the 30 milliliter example, and I want it to have 3 grams. So I'll put 3 grams of the plant material in a container, and then I'll just barely cover it with alcohol. And then whatever that remaining alcohol is after that's macerated, that gets added directly to the oil.
Oh,
and then smart. Then you're actually going to heat both of those together.
And
heat it.
Alcohol.
Yeah, burn off the alcohol. You want to do it on like a medium high heat. You don't want it boiling really crazy, and you don't want to burn the oil. I think for me, grapeseed oil has been the best one to use when you're doing the tincture method, because grapeseed oil has a much higher burning temperature. So it's not going to splatter, it's not going to catch on fire like coconut oil will. So grapeseed is a good one to do when you're doing the tincture. So the tincture is just essentially the alcohol is acting as a vehicle for the plant material. So don't get too hung up on like how much alcohol is supposed to be in the tincture, because it really doesn't matter.
No, I like
Um,
the idea of measuring it out that way, just putting your plant material right there and just covering it, and that's perfect.
yep,
Yeah,
yep,
that's very smart. Thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah, definitely. Another way that you could kind of skip the whole tincture process if you wanted to, and it's not that one's like a lot better than the other, they're just kind of different options. You have the alcohol intermediary method, which is basically you're taking your dry plant material and then you're pouring just a little tiny bit of high proof alcohol over it just to wet
Mhm.
it down, and that kind of starts the extraction process.
Right.
And once you've done that, then you would add your oil and infuse on heat. So you're not having to go through the boiling process. That's another option as well.
Oh, okay. I
Yeah.
got you.
When I
So
do
many
that,
different ways.
that is
Yeah.
so fun, so many different ways. It's like one of my favorite things. But when I do the alcohol intermediary method, what I have been doing to kind of help that a little bit is I take a little bit of citric acid and I sprinkle it on the dry plant material
Mhm.
before I add the alcohol. So
For
then we're getting,
preservation.
it helps with preservation, but it's more so because that slight change in pH is enough to pull the plant material out. So we're
Gotcha.
changing the pH just a little bit in like one direction or another. And by doing that, it's creating a chemical process that is pulling those alkaloids out a little bit better than just heat would.
Gotcha. That's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, totally.
Very cool.
Anyone else have any other questions? Yeah, that's basically the big thing, is just kind of considering different carrier oils and the pH. Talk about the ratio of wood ash in oil infusions. So one thing you want to be careful with wood ash is that it is very alkaline. It is very basic. It can be caustic. So wood ash, like when it's mixed with um, water and things like that, it goes through like the saponification, where we're like the soap making process. Well, lye, which is what's resulting from that, can be very caustic to the skin and it can cause a lot of irritation. So you don't want to go crazy with the ash. When I do mine, I'm just doing, it's like 1 teaspoon to 250 milliliters. So it's like a very small amount. So if you were making like like a 1 ounce tin, I would just sprinkle very little in there. But the addition of essential oils, I really believe, helps with absorption in a similar way to what wood ash would. I'm also starting to think that a lot of these astringent herbs that we see in the ointments, the recipes, those have something to do with the absorption. Um, so just doing it in different ways. The recent experiment with lard. So I did an infusion on Patreon for I was doing pork lard. I did a pork lard infusion and I did it with belladonna berries. So typically I just use like the leaves and stems. Sometimes I'll do a combination, but this one was just strictly berries, which we know it has the same components as the rest of the plant. And I found that the pork lard ointment, it really did absorb a lot better. Um, I don't know if I noticed a huge difference in the, the observable effects as far as like changing my perception or consciousness. I think it's pretty similar to all of my other ointments. I use the same formulation. It was just a matter of, after applying it within a couple of hours, any kind of like pain or neck tension, which I have a lot of just from like being on the computer all the time, that was gone. And then two, like when you would touch the skin afterwards, there would be nothing there. So you know that like all of that product was absorbed, wherewith the plant-based ointments, you're left with the residue basically until you wash it off, because of the waxes and things like that. So doing like a combination of the pork lard, or maybe even like a coconut oil that is unprocessed, one that's more solid at room temperature. Jojoba oil is also supposed to be really good for absorption. Any other questions?
Hi. So,
Hey.
hey. So I really want to take your formulary class because I'm just super interested, and I'm sure on Patreon also. But I'm curious, when you do the alcohol intermediary method, wouldn't you get a much more potent extraction of the tropane alkaloids? Like, so would you use less plant material per, like you were talking about the 1-to-10 ratios and stuff like that, or like 3 grams per container? So
The 1-to-10 ratio is a very safe ratio to work in, I think, regardless of what method you're using. I think without using any kind of additional extraction method, if you were just to do an oil infusion just with heat, you're still going to get some kind of medicinal benefits. It's not soluble in the oil, in that it's not like dissolving in the way that it would in alcohol, but it's still kind of being suspended in there, so you're still getting like that topical medicinal benefit. So something like that's going to be better for like pain relief, more surface type things, where doing with the alcohol intermediary method or incorporating different changes in pH, that's going to get it into the bloodstream a little bit more. So that's going to be more of a system-wide kind of a thing versus just a very localized. So I wouldn't adjust the formulation any lower than like a 1-to-10, even if you are using the alcohol intermediary method.
thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Yes. All right. I think it's about 15 minutes to go until 10 o'clock. I have been experimenting with the magic butter machine, which has saved me a lot of time in making my oil infusions, because I'm able to make a lot more. And then also like the addition of, it stirs it, it heats it, it does all of these things. So I've been experimenting with that just to see, is it better? Is it the same? It's definitely faster. I'm still doing like the alcohol intermediary method when I do the infusions, still adding like citric acid and different things like that. I think the past few batches I've made with that, I've used the coconut oil, and you can really see like a visual difference, I feel like, in the coconut oil as well. Where regardless of what you're infusing in it, whether it's belladonna berries or green plant material, you're getting like a much more vibrant end result. So you can kind of tell like the coconut oil is definitely, pulling something out that maybe the grapeseed oil isn't. But again, these are all just like some of my theories and things that I've discovered like along the way in doing this. And that's like part of the exciting part, that like all these years later, like I'm still finding out stuff and like, oh, I wish I would have known that 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah, I'm working on some other different techniques for absorption and different additives and things like that, and kind of picking apart some of these other recipes and into how to like really explain the science behind it, because these ointments were around for like a very, very long time, before even the Middle Ages. People using these plants medicinally, and they were known for their there's sleep-inducing effects, used as in different surgical type situations, all the way back to the ancient world. People have been performing surgeries using mandrake-infused wine and opium and things like that. So there's definitely, something to the effects of these salves being very soporific and having a very profound effect, just through oil infusion. So no internal ingestion involved, no smoking involved, nothing like that. So it's definitely like within the realm of possibility to create something that is safe to use, but it's still going to give you that noticeable kind of experience. So I will try to get the recording out to everybody. Oh, another question about the Amanita not being fat soluble. Yeah, so I've heard that too. And Amanita Dreamer talks about it in one of her videos as well, because she makes a muscaria oil. I think it's the same way that the tropane alkaloids aren't necessarily fat soluble, so they're not being dissolved, they're not being like completely absorbed into that carrier, but they are still being suspended. So you can even get psychoactive effects from, just holding an Amanita mushroom on your skin for an extended period of time. So while they're not oil soluble in the sense of like being completely soluble, it is still possible to extract the Amanita into oil and use it for pain relief, anxiety, entheogenic purposes, things like that. There's a special preparation method that she actually talks about on her page. It's basically, instead of using the entire mushroom, you're just using like the darkest parts of the center, which is where the most concentrated alkaloids are, is kind of her theory with it. I found with mine, I use powdered Amanita in my oil infusions. And I almost wonder if it has something to do with like having the datura oil already infused in there, if there is like some slight change in alkalinity because of the presence of those alkaloids, that it actually helps to pull the muscimol out of the Amanita. And again, that's just like one of my theories. I'm not a chemist, but that's kind of what it feels like is happening. Yeah, she is awesome. I love her work. AmanitaDreamer.net for anything you can possibly want to know about working with Amanita. But yeah, you could totally extract it into alcohol and then add it to your oil. The only thing with that is typically with mushrooms and with Amanita, you need kind of like a double extraction sort of a process. So like if you're taking it internally, typically you would do like a decoction and you would decoct it twice. Or you would do a decoction and then you would add lemon juice to it. So you're kind of doing that extra step to extract a higher percentage of that into there. So if you were to do the alcohol extract before adding it into your oil, I would probably add some apple cider vinegar or citric acid. I wouldn't do lemon juice if you're adding it to an oil, just because of like the whole water issue with the lemon juice. But that's what the citric acid is nice for. Like if you need to create an acidic environment and you don't want to add water to something, just a little pinch of citric acid will do that. All right, well, I'm going to make sure that the recordings get sent out to everybody. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope everybody learned something. Thanks, Brandon, for tuning in. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks, Hazel, Lisa. Night, guys, Lena. I will get the recordings out, like I've said, like 5 times. I think I have everybody's emails. If I miss you, just shoot me an email. And if you guys have any additional questions after class, over the next few days or whatever, anytime, just let me know. Thank you, guys. Have a happy night. Happy Halloween.